Thanks, Craig. Well, thank you. Thanks all of you for coming. Thank you, Craig, for the very kind introduction. I want to say a special hi to my kids who never ever get to see me do my job, and to those of you I work with who never ever see me wear a tie. So this is groundbreaking on a whole bunch of reasons. So as Craig mentioned, this is part of a research project that in some ways I've been doing for almost 20 years. I began asking questions about this to myself for 20 years, have been working on this on and off for 15 years, and in a more sustained way over the past 3 years. We're in the midst of a 5-year project where we're doing a lot of research into the way digital technology is reshaping the way citizens engage with their political system in Canada. And so this is research in progress. In fact, some of the data that I'm going to be presenting tonight, I literally just got 3 weeks ago from a survey we did following the federal election this fall. And so some of that's being presented here for the very first time. Now, like all research projects of this size and this magnitude, this isn't something that I do alone. Craig mentioned my dream team, so I want to mention these 4 people with whom I work, this smart and talented bunch. And I especially want to mention Royce Coop there in the bottom right. Royce Coop is now the chair of political science at the University of Manitoba, but 15 years ago he was an undergraduate student here at the University of Lethbridge. And he worked as a research assistant with me on this very question. While he went to graduate school, we continued to cooperate on this and work on this, and we're still working together 15 years later. I met him my first year teaching. He was in his first year as a student here, and this research partnership has continued for 17 years, and it's something I know I'm really proud of that we can do at the university, that we continue to collaborate. Now, the reason I mention these people is they've helped design the survey. They helped to gather the data that I'm presenting. They're not responsible for any errors unless they're really egregious, in which case it's probably Royce's fault. I'd also like to just mention the financial support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. As we found out doing this project, survey research is really, really expensive. And without the financial support of SSHRC, this would be impossible. So with the preliminaries out of the way, I want to start by saying something that would seem to be almost an obvious statement, but it's actually something, when you think about it, that's pretty important. And that's this, is that politics in democratic societies is largely conducted through communication. When you think about how we engage in the activity of building support for collective projects, we do it through things like debate. We debate in Parliament or right around the corner there in City Council chambers. Leaders try to persuade us to vote for them. We try to persuade others to change their views, or we try to communicate our preferences to leaders, but it all happens through communication. So when there's a change in the way we communicate with one another, that's going to have political implications. And that's really what this talk is about. So there's 2 concepts in the title, right? The impact of digital technology on democratic communication, so on democratic citizenship. So I want to talk first a little bit about what I mean by digital technology. So by this, I mean the widespread adoption of the internet as a communications tool. Now, the internet's been around a long time. It's been around for several decades. I started using it, I can say, a couple of years before it got really cool, and I've got data now to prove that. I was ahead of the curve. But it really took off in the mid-1990s was when it really accelerated. And as a social scientist looking at this, computer scientists might differ about when the big breakthroughs were. The big breakthrough was this, and some of you who are older might remember the Mosaic web browser. Really big breakthrough, because in the past when you wanted to go online, you'd have to learn Unix commands and do things like telnet and all these really cool esoteric things that were all very text-based. But this provided a point-and-click interface for the internet. It allowed eventually for the display of a really radical concept for the internet, pictures, videos, increasing multimedia content, and it all started with this browser in 1994. And you can see that in the way that internet use took off in Canada after that. So this is data I've gathered from a variety of sources. Most of it's from the International Telecommunications Union, but some of the earlier data is from 1994, and I had to extrapolate 95 to 99. I couldn't find good data. And you can see, and I apologize for the very, very small type here, but basically this shows 2 decades from 1994 through 2013, and the graph just goes up to 100%. And you can see the way internet use accelerated once the Mosaic browser came into effect. it went from less than 20% of people using it to, by the turn of the century, about half of Canadians using it, to the point now where we have almost 90% use of the internet. So in our survey, one of the things we asked, we did a telephone survey first, we asked people whether they were internet users, and I weighted this number with a bit of trepidation because it was way off from what I know from other data. I know we have problems, and this is the number that our survey respondents gave us. About 88% of people were online. And so that was very reassuring to us because that was exactly in keeping with all the other data to which we could compare. So internet access is not entirely universal yet. But internet access is getting there. It's getting pretty close. This issue of who has internet access and who doesn't was something that really preoccupied political scientists, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it raised questions about what we call the digital divide. So this is a big theme in the literature because it takes money and skill to use the technology. Now, money is a big issue, right? You have to be able to afford the equipment, the phone, or the computer. You have to pay for internet access, and those resources aren't equally distributed in society. So there were concerns about there being a gap between people who could afford to be online and those who couldn't. Now, in our research, what we've actually found is it's actually not money that seems to drive this, but it's actually age. We found that people under 30 had virtually universal access to the internet, and it trails off as people get older. So most of the people who are not online tend to be much older. So it's actually age that drives this. Now, you might object, well, you're doing a survey, so of course you're going to tend to get survey research of people who are more affluent, right? They're the kind of people who are going to have phones that we can reach with these surveys. But I actually had some students do a project in my digital politics class this fall, and they came up with a really interesting idea, which was to look at-risk youth. So they actually surveyed some youth that were involved in a local program for at-risk youth and actually found among these youth, many of whom had inconsistent access to safe housing. Some of them lived on the streets all the time or periodically, but every single one of them had internet access. Almost all of them had phones. Not all of them had homes, right? And so for those of us who might prize shelter and stable living situations over digital access, it was actually very eye-opening for me what my students found, and that really struck me. So age is the driver here, much more than socioeconomic status. Now, of course, since the 90s, and in the last decade especially, we've seen internet technology change in a very profound way, and that's the rise of social networking. So we found in our survey roughly 57% of Canadians are on Facebook. Now, if we take just of internet users, that number rises to about 63%. So Canadians are very big users of Facebook. But we'll talk a little bit about the political implications of that in a second. Now, Twitter is a really interesting one to me because journalists really love Twitter. I don't know if you watch the news on election night. The thing that drives me crazy, and my wife, who's here tonight, can attest to this, because I start yelling at the TV at this point, where journalists start reading things from Twitter on television. And if I want to know what people are saying on Twitter, I will go to, say, Twitter to find out. So journalists are really obsessed with Twitter, mostly because they think it's important. And why is it important? Because they're on it. Well, why are they on it? Well, because Twitter's really important. Bit of circular logic. So what we found is that only 18% of Canadians actually are at all active on Twitter. It's 20% of internet users. Typically, of those 18%, from we know data from Twitter, only about 1/5 of those actually really use those accounts. There's a lot of people who think they should be on Twitter. I remember when I got a notice that my dad was following me on Twitter. I don't think he's ever logged on since, other than to find me and follow me. So a lot of people don't actually use those accounts, and I've got some data that will show that. So when I have the idea of digital technology, this is really what I'm talking about, right, is this big communications revolution. So the other big concept in the talk is the idea of democratic citizenship. And by this, I mean the practices that we undertake as citizens. We're members of the political community. We are supposed to, and we do to various degrees, engage in the political system. So I want to talk a little bit about the state of citizenship in Canada, just a broad overview, and then a little tiny bit of theory, nothing too scary, and then I will get to what our findings are. So overall, we find that Canadians aren't especially engaged with the political system. So I have a couple of my graduates or survivors, as they like to call themselves, of my political behavior class who can attest to this from the research that we looked at, and that Canadians aren't especially politically active. Voter turnout in Canada is actually relatively low by comparative context compared to other developed democracies. We got very excited when we got our voter turnout up to around 70% in the last election. And that's mostly because it was down to around 60 for the last couple of decades. But in a comparative context, that's really not very high. And it was low pre-internet. It continues to be relatively low. Party membership is relatively low. My friend and colleague, Lisa Young at the University of Calgary, did a study and found that the average political party member in Canada is 60 years old. That's the average. That's pretty astonishing. And while I personally think it's great that seniors are getting involved in politics, that's good. That is substantially above the Canadian average. And it suggests, well, why aren't more youth getting involved? There's very little protest activity. Canadians don't really like to protest. One thing we love to do, Canadians love to sign petitions. We are one of the best in the world at signing petitions. Maybe because going to political party meetings and protesting, it's a little cold to do that. Petitions, you just lean out the door and sign them and move on. We know that Canadians don't have especially high levels of interest in politics. It's tough to compare levels of information cross-nationally, but the studies we do have suggest that Canadians don't actually know a lot about politics. This was true before the internet, and the studies since the internet took off, it continues to be true. So this raises a big question. Well, why aren't more people involved in the political process? So I'm going to give you three simple umbrella answers, and these are going to tie into the talk later. So there's three big possible explanations. First one, they can't. Getting involved in politics takes resources, right? It's not something that's open to everybody. There's three big resources that I think are important. There's money. Some forms of political participation, running for office, for example, you need to either have money to fund your campaign or know people who have money who are willing to give it to you to fund your campaign. You need to have skills, literacy skills at a bare minimum to function, but certain kinds of skills of organization, communication are very important, and those aren't evenly distributed in society. And a big one we often overlook is time. It takes time to get involved in politics. If you're working an extra part-time job to make ends meet with for your family, you don't have time to get involved politically. If your kids are involved in the arts and you're really busy driving them to piano lessons or to dance recitals or other kinds of things, you may not have time to get involved in politics. Or if you have a very demanding job that requires you to work all kinds of crazy hours, you might also not have time to get involved politically. So if you lack some or all of these things, you're less likely to participate in politics. So that's the first thing, is some people can't. The other reason that people don't get involved in politics is they just don't want to. Now, I find this astonishing, but apparently some people don't like politics and are not interested in politics, and they don't want to get involved. There actually has been research that has been funded, and this will seem really obvious, and it will annoy you that taxpayer money has been spent to fund research to prove that people who are more interested in politics are more likely to engage in it. I'm going to reestablish that a little bit later, just as a bit of foreshadowing. But this is one of the reasons, right? Some people just don't want to get involved. And the third reason why people don't get involved in politics generally is nobody asks them to. So getting recruited to participate in politics is important. Being asked to vote, somebody coming to your door and asking you to support them. Being asked to join a political party, very important. Being asked to participate in a protest, for example, can be very important. And we know from a lot of the research that we've done, and a former student of mine, Melanie Thomas, now at the University of Calgary, has done research that there's actually very important gendered effects to this. We know a lot of the political recruitment for young women actually, if nobody asks them, they don't get involved. And that's a really important and powerful factor. So these three things work together, right? And we have fancier names that we use in political science. We'll talk about them as resources, motivation, and mobilization. But political engagement is driven by these three things. If you lack one or all of these, you're much less likely to be engaged. And so you can see the potential that the digital revolution might have, right? It reduces resource costs. Having access to information is actually an important resource. By making information more easily and quickly and cheaply available, presumably this could help to level some of those resource gaps and make it easier for people to participate in politics. For mobilization, it can make communication much easier, faster, cheaper. You can reach a wide audience much more quickly. Social media especially can contribute to that. So those are some of the ways in which we might see this happening. Now, there's three aspects of citizenship practices that I'm going to talk about in this talk, and this isn't exhaustive. This isn't it for citizenship, and you can, if you think, oh, I've done this, I've done all three of these, I'm good, I don't have to do any more. There are many others that you can and should participate in, but these are three that I'm going to look at. So one is paying attention to politics, attentiveness to politics, gathering information. The second is communicating with political elites. And the third is directly participating in politics through a variety of mechanisms. Voting is probably the most visible and the most well-known of these. So when I talk about democratic citizenship, this is really what I'm talking about. So how is the communications revolution changing these kinds of citizen activities? So to answer this, my dream team and I, we've been doing survey research. So we did a large telephone survey about 2 years ago, and we've done 2 waves of an internet survey. We have a third wave planned for later this year, and we want to do some qualitative follow-up research with some of our respondents. So as I said, this is a moving project. So a lot of my conclusions here are tentative because we're still waiting to really dig into some of the data we've gathered and to verify some of the things that we've found. So first, let me talk about information gathering. So you might remember, and thankfully this nomenclature has fallen away, remember when we used to talk about the information superhighway? I'm glad we don't anymore because that was a really horrible phrase. We sometimes call what I'm talking about the information revolution. So we should expect to see big changes in the way people gather information. And that's certainly what we expected to find in our survey. And there's some truth to that, but there's also some important continuity. So what we found in our survey is that the most important source of political information for most people continues to be television. Again, I apologize for the small type, but the big bar is television. About half of the people in Canada, according to our research, still get their primary information from television news. Online news and print news, so print news is the next column, for those of you who are having trouble seeing this, going from right to left, and the one that's tied with it is online news sites, are basically about even. Radio is the one in the middle. There are still some people who primarily get their political information from radio. And then on the far left here is other internet, and here's where we put in the question, we actually specified, including social media. If you primarily get informed through things like Facebook and Twitter, that's where you were supposed to answer. So if you combine these two categories, stack them on top of each other, you'd have roughly a quarter of Canadians are getting their information online. So it actually surprised me a little bit that that wasn't higher, given all the noise that we make about Facebook and Twitter and the digital revolution. But here's an important thing that we found out. This is changing. And again, the really important effect, the really important driver is age. So if we look at television, so these are the age breakdown for different, who sees television as their primary news source. So 18 to 29-year-olds on the right, so 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70 and older. And you find that, right, as you get older, you're more likely to rely on television. The big gap is people over 40 and under 40. Newspapers, we see a similar sort of trend, although the gap is 50 and over and under 50, and the numbers are much smaller. But you still see a very similar kind of thing. Now, we know from pre-internet, television quickly in the 50s and 60s became the most trusted, the most used, the most important news source for people about politics. That's what a lot of the literature that in graduate school I spent time reading. And so it's not surprising that television continues to outstrip print, but you definitely see that among youth, very, very few of them use print media as their primary news source. So what about the internet? Well, for news websites, here we see the age curve absolutely invert, right? So if you're younger, you're more likely to rely on news websites. Very clear age pattern, exactly the reverse of what we see in newspapers and television. And finally, other internet, including social media, this trails off even more dramatically as you get older. So clear age effect here as well. Now, it is actually a bit tricky to disentangle from the previous. Often social media posts are actually links to stories on news websites. So it's a bit tricky to actually distinguish this from the previous category. So here I'm going to tie all these previous slides together in one glorious master slide that tells the whole story of the change in media consumption. And you can see the red line is all of those internet sources, both those categories combined. I've dropped radio here. Television is the yellow bar, print news is the blue bar, and you can see the very clear age effect. Now, whenever we find an age effect in political science, and I could quiz my political behavior class survivors here, there's two possible explanations. They had to learn this for the exam that they wrote 3 weeks ago. There's a cohort effect or a life cycle effect. So there's certain things that we get in our life. For example, use of healthcare would look something like the television graph, right? As we get older, we tend to use the healthcare system more because as we get older, more and more stuff starts to break down. Yes, I am turning 50 this year, so I'm becoming very cognizant of this. But there's also cohort effects or generational effects where there's changes in generational replacement. This is a generational effect. This is not a cohort effect. I don't expect that suddenly when these people turn 40, they're going to put their computers and cell phones away and start watching TV. No, they grew up using digital technology. They will continue to do so. So what does this mean? What are the implications of this? Well, the media tells us something really important. They tell us what's happening. But more importantly, they tell us what's important. The media make all kinds of judgments for us. They make decisions about what the most important story of the day is. How long is Peter Mansbridge going to talk about one particular thing? What's he going to start with? What's he going to end with? What's the amusing little story right at the end so you don't feel too depressed when you turn off the newscast? They make all those decisions. Editorial boards of newspapers do that as well. What's going to be on the front page? What's the lead headline? There's only so much space. What stories are going to get covered? What's not going to get covered? And they signal us those things. And so when we flip through a newspaper, we notice a lot of things. When you turn on a newscast and you watch, for example, I'm a fan of the Edmonton Oilers, so I usually want to find out, it's typically how badly did they lose this time. So if I'm waiting to watch the sports, I've got to wait through 15 minutes and a half-hour newscast. I have to sit through a lot of other news to get there. Now, how does digital technology change this? Well, with the move to digital technology, we choose which websites to go to. Our media habits are much more self-selecting. And so this self-selection makes it very easy for us to pick the news to which we'd like to be exposed and to avoid news which we'd like to avoid. We can choose which websites we go to. And that's really important development. Now, I'd argue that this has actually been exacerbated by social media because increasingly people don't go to cbc.ca/news to find out what the stories of the day are because somebody at CBC makes decisions about what's going to be the lead and what doesn't. But what they do is they rely on their Facebook or Twitter feeds. And they do this in two ways, right? One way is that your friends see something on Twitter or on Facebook, and I'll use Facebook as the example because it's probably the most pernicious in this respect. Somebody will see something, oh, that's an interesting story, I'm going to share it on Facebook, right? And so they'll share it. And so you will look on Facebook and it will show up on your Facebook feed, so-and-so saw this and they shared it with you. And you might think it's interesting or not. Now, when you think about it, the people that you likely have as Facebook friends probably share a lot of things in common with you. They may have largely similar views to what you have. Not all the time. We have all had people who have annoyed us on social media somehow, and a lot of times we end up kicking them off. There have been surveys showing how many Canadians have actually unfriended somebody because they dislike their political views. But, I mean, that's a good example. You're likely to get people who agree with you sharing things that they enjoyed. Now, the other thing we do is instead of actually going to cbc.ca, you will just follow them on Facebook. Now, here's the really important thing, and I'm going to single out Facebook here. Twitter is trying to move in this direction. Facebook used to work that the most recent thing posted is the first thing that's going to show up for you. That's not how it works anymore. Facebook has one big thing that they're trying to accomplish. And no, it's not sharing cat videos. The big thing they are trying to accomplish is to get you to spend as much time as you possibly can on Facebook. They want you to go back and check it as often as you can, and I will refrain from asking you how many of you have checked Facebook since I started talking, and I know there's at least one person out there who has probably done this. But they want you to spend as much time on it as possible. And they have algorithms that are opaque that keep track of how much time you spend looking at certain parts of the page, how much time you spend on a particular story. And if they see you like looking at certain kinds of stories, they'll give you more of that. Oh, Harold really likes watching cat videos. I don't actually, for the record, but this is just an example. I'm a dog person. But so they'll say, oh, let's make sure he sees more cat videos. Oh, Harold really finds stories about global warming and the need to change our lifestyles to transition to a post-carbon future really depressing, and he doesn't like reading those. We won't give him very many of those. So you can see how this has the potential to just give us things with which we agree. There's a self-selection bias. So what I was really interested in, there are two things I'm going to look at here. One is, does this impact our political knowledge? Now, the five of us who are doing the survey are professors, and we can not resist giving people exams, and we even do it on surveys. So we actually had a political knowledge test in our survey. We asked people 4 questions. We asked them, could they name which party was the official opposition? And we did this in 2014. By the way, for those of you who are New Democrats in the crowd, I have to warn you that already I saw you guys were in big trouble, because when I was listening in on the pretest of our survey, I was amazed how many people were saying liberal. The NDP was invisible. A lot of people got this wrong. The second thing we asked was whether people could name the Minister of Finance. One of the problems we had while our survey was in the field, the Minister of Finance chose that time to resign. Very annoying. So I, being a very kind professor and having learned lots from our teaching center, graded them very generously. And if they said Jim Flaherty or Joe Oliver at any point in our survey, I gave them full marks for that. We asked them to name the Chancellor of Germany, and we asked them also, we gave this as a multiple choice question, we gave them 4 names and asked them to pick out the founder of WikiLeaks, and if they got Julian Assange's name. Correct? They got a point. So you could get 0 to 100 on this. So what we wanted to do is look at, well, how did people differ in terms of their knowledge? Now, I know a lot of things from the research on political knowledge, the kinds of things that are going to drive whether people do well on tests like this. So we know, for example, the degree of political interest matters. We know whether they have a university degree matters. We know age makes a difference. We know gender makes a difference. So I wanted to control for those things that I was really interested in was to see the impact of your news source. So I'm going to spare you the math behind this. I have a couple of statisticians and mathematicians in the crowd, so we're going to not get into the gory math details. So this is basically looks at the independent variable, or the independent impact of all of these things when we control these in a model. Now, I expected to see online news, as people rely on online news, being less knowledgeable, but in fact, it actually was statistically significant. Now, the effect is actually quite modest. That's a really small increase. That's a 7 or 8 point difference if you did one standard deviation better, or if you used online news. But the comparison, the references with television, this is a really important point. We tend to fear the new and sort of argue that what's in the past or what we currently have is better. Now, I could bring you, and I resisted doing this, a stack of books and articles written prior to the internet about how bad television is for political knowledge. That because television is about visuals and sound, it's not very good for conveying a lot of content. If you were to type up the transcript of a half-hour newscast, it might be 1/3 of a page of a newspaper. That's it. That's how little content is actually being conveyed. It's about the images. It is about the sound. It's not really about the textual content. So the thing about online news is that, it actually is fairly text-heavy. And so at best, if we are going to say, okay, that particular effect is really so small, but it's not, things aren't getting any worse. Now, the more interesting thing to me was the question about whether people go to stuff that reinforces their opinions. And this is actually really hard to research because I'd have to know in a lot of detail what kind of stories people are looking at. I'd have to pretty much spy on their internet activity and then survey them afterwards. I'd need to cooperate with the NSA in the United States, basically, and eavesdrop on everybody's phone conversations and suck up all their digital data. Apparently, there are some ethical problems with doing that, so that's not really open to me. However, we have a way of kind of getting at this. So in December 2014, we did a survey of 3,000 Canadians online, and one of the things we asked them was a concept called party identification. This is something we've used in political science for over 5 decades, and it's well tested. It works really well. It's how people situate themselves in the partisan landscape. So here's how we ask it. We'll say, generally speaking, in national politics, do you consider yourself a conservative, a New Democrat, a liberal? We would include Green. If we're asking this in Quebec, we'd include the Bloc Québécois, or none of these. And then if they say they're one of those, then we'll ask, are you very strongly, somewhat strongly, or not very strongly? And if then they're in the first two, if they're very or fairly strongly, we consider them identifiers. So we asked people that in December 2014. Now this works really well because then we re-interviewed all those people after the election. And we asked them, what kind of things did you look at online? And so I actually have this really good measure independently of the election, well before the election. And we often find that people will change their party identification because of their vote, right? Oh, I voted Liberal, so therefore I must be a Liberal. And we wanted to get some sense of how they identify themselves well before the election. But now I've got this, and I can compare now how they showed, or what they looked at online, or at least what they told us. And we found some really interesting things that lend some support to this self-selection hypothesis. All right, so what I've got here, the columns represent different party identifications. So people with no identification, people who identify themselves as conservatives, people who identify themselves as liberals, people who identify themselves as NDP, and then which websites they visited. So let's look at the nones first. So you'll see they were fairly even. More of them looked at the Liberal website, which is probably understanding, considering it was pretty clear the Liberals were going to win the election, and people wanted to know a little bit what to expect. So that didn't really surprise me. But you notice conservatives, right, far more likely to look at the Conservative Party website. Liberals, far more likely to look at the Liberal Party website. New Democrats are the ones who kind of blow my, what would be a really beautiful table. But you can see this, given what we know about the election, this isn't surprising, right? The story is a lot of New Democrats decided they were liberals in the federal election, and you can see the evidence in their media habits. The really interesting thing to me, though, is if we look at the ideological extremes, only 6.5% of New Democrats bothered to look at a Conservative Party website. Only 7.4% of conservatives bothered to look at the NDP website. So the other just point I'll make in passing is actually also how low these numbers are. I'll return to that in a minute. This is during an election, and very few people actually went to party websites. We looked at who people followed or friended on Facebook, and you see the same pattern. The numbers are lower overall. Again, I'll pick up on that in a minute. A lot of people don't follow politicians, candidates, parties on Facebook, which is actually pretty interesting. But you notice the same patterns again. Look at the ideological extremes. Only 1.6% of New Democrats actually followed or friended a conservative candidate or the party on Facebook, and we see a similar low percentage for conservatives with New Democrats. Twitter, we got to do it. Look how low the numbers are. And you see the same pattern. Exactly 0 New Democrats that we surveyed who were on Twitter followed a conservative on Twitter. Very few, and almost no conservatives follow New Democrats on Twitter. So we see some evidence here consistent with this argument that people seek out arguments that confirm their political views, and they're going to avoid arguments and views that avoid this. And because of the internet, and especially because of social media, we get to construct our own media environment. We get to self-select our exposure. Now, to be fair, though, this tendency is not just limited to digital communication. There has been a shift in the traditional media as well. Now, I can't really think of an example, but you might be able to think of one if you think really hard that there might be examples of mainstream media, traditional media outlets that really just present one side of the story. Second thing that we looked at was interacting with political elites. So we wanted to look at the ways in which we communicated with that Canadians are communicating with their political elites. So typically we learn about the political system through the media. Very few people read Hansard and eagerly await for the new one to be posted each day from Parliament on the website. I know all of you do, but other people don't apparently. Very few people watch the parliamentary channel regularly. Very few of us actually directly talk to elected officials to learn what's going on. And so one of the things that the internet really opened up was the possibility for us to directly interact with politicians. And there was a lot of optimism about this in the 90s and the early 2000s, and there was a really big focus in the literature on interactivity. Would there be interactivity? How much were politicians providing this opportunity to interact? And I did some of this research, and we'd score different websites on interactivity. But something I started to notice especially as Royce and I did this research, as we look at, hardly any candidates are providing discussion forums where people can ask questions. But then we actually found a few candidates who did, and one of the things that struck us was that nobody ever posted on them and ever asked questions, which really struck us. I actually had to get mad at my research assistants because a few of them actually felt really bad for these people, and they started posting questions and were contaminating my research results because they felt bad about this. But it started to have us ask this question, well, how many people actually do really interact with politicians? So what do people look at online? How do they interact? The dream was at that time that we would see situations like this, and I'm really proud that I found this picture. This is Justin Trudeau on a Google Hangout. And this is what we thought would happen, this deep, rich democracy where this would be possible, right? Where we could interact and politicians, there would be something in it for them. They could bypass that troublesome media that always just wants to tell people that things are going wrong, communicate directly with voters. We could ask and engage them deeply. So we asked in 2014 in our telephone survey, how many people what kind of political content they've been accessing online. So this is not during an election. During an election, these things go up. Now, you'll notice, so the far right one is federal government website. About half of Canadians said they'd been to a federal government website in the previous 12 months. Almost half went to a provincial government website. 40% or so went to the local government website. So we call this e-government in the digital politics literature. And this is actually a really big thing. And you could see why, right? You need a passport application. Well, you can download one. I want to find out when my vehicle registration is due. I'll go on the provincial government website. It's the holidays, right? How is this going to affect my garbage collection schedule? Well, I'll go to the City of Lethbridge website and find that out. So a lot of Canadians do this. When we get, though, to e-politics, which is this, we find very few people are engaged. Just a little over 10% actually went to a party website in the previous 12 months, and this just blew us away. Only about 6% of Canadians followed a politician or party or candidate on Facebook or were friends with them. Less than 5% did so on Twitter. Hardly anybody, so these people are putting stuff out on the internet and hardly anybody is paying attention. Now, to be fair to citizens, and I'm going to be harsh on citizens in a little bit, if you do follow the social media presence of a lot of politicians, a lot of it is pretty banal, right? It's not very interesting. It is a great day to be a Canadian is the kind of thing that you might see on Twitter. And what are you going to say? No, it's not. Maybe where you are. I don't know, right? Again, Central Canadian elites telling us to have a good day. I don't know, right? There's not really a lot to be said about that. So to be fair to Canadians, political leaders don't do a very, very good job of providing engaging kind of content. So I'll absolutely grant that. But Canadians aren't very interested. We also asked people how they'd contacted, if they've had to, for those people who had to contact public officials, how they'd done so. Most common was they phoned them. Second most common was they went and saw them in person. Third most common was they wrote a letter. People still write letters. I was pretty astonished to find this. 16% went to an internet forum. Only 12% sent an email. So most people were choosing very, very traditional forms of interaction, centuries-old forms of interactions with elected officials. We asked them, how would you prefer to deal with your elected official? 40% said the telephone. So the digital revolution, as far as our communication with elected officials, doesn't seem to be happening, partly because citizens don't want to, and partly there is a preference for some of these older forms of communication. Political participation, and this is going to be, I'm going to do this reasonably quickly. It's probably actually the most complex part. So we can look at traditional forms of participation, from voting to party activity, to protests, petitions, right? I mentioned Canadians like petitions, I'll show you that. But also what one scholar of political participation and digital technology calls discursive participation. And so these are people who like to discuss politics online. So we wanted to look at all three. So we asked people which of these they did. So the first two are, did you vote in the last federal election, vote in the last provincial election? Now you notice I have voter turnout at 80%. So we were doing this in 2014. The previous federal election had voter turnout of 60%. So yes, we are overrepresenting the politically engaged. The problem with survey research is if you call my house and you get me on the phone and say, hi, I'd like to ask you to do a 20-minute survey about politics, I'm all over that. If you call up and say, I'd like to spend 20 minutes and ask you questions about your attitudes towards professional wrestling, I probably have other things that I would rather be doing. So we tend to have this self-selection bias in people answering surveys. So this overrepresents people's political activity. To be fair, the other big study that looks, called the Canada Election Study, that looks at voter behavior, when they studied the 2011 election, they got 90% voter turnout. So ours was more accurate than theirs, which we rub in their faces when we see them at conferences. Offline persuasion is the next one. About half of Canadians actually argue and discuss politics and try to get people to change their views, and then it drops off. They're signing a petition. I told you Canadians like to sign petitions. There is the number. About 18% said they had signed a petition in the previous year, and then it drops off. Boycotting product or service, belonging to a political party, trailing off, right? Very small percentages. Online participation. Okay, I kept the scale the same, even though it makes it a little harder to look at. You look at the big drop. Boom. Not a lot of people are doing things online. Number one is signing a petition online. This is the one form of activity that people like to do online more than offline. Canadians like this, right? And we like doing it online as well. Sharing political content on Facebook. Hardly anybody does this. Only about 12% of Canadians actually said they shared any political content with their Facebook friends. Online persuasion, arguing, discussing politics online, just around 10%. Posting something about politics on Facebook, so writing something political, very few people. Commenting on political news, right? Those horrible, horrible comments you see on CBC. No one's fessing up to writing those, apparently. Or it's a very small group of people with a whole lot of time on their hands and a lot of awful things to say, I must say. Retweeting political content, right? We know Twitter use is very small. Again, more evidence that the social media revolution on politics, it's a small group of people writing a whole lot of stuff on Twitter. So what we wanted to do is and this gets into the really statistical part. I'm going to gloss over the math because most of you aren't interested. Olu would be very interested. The rest of you, Dennis is here. Dennis would probably be interested as well. The rest of you don't want to hear this, so I'm not going to tell you. So this looks at, these are the kinds of things we looked at, how they affected participation. So with offline participation, we found that older people were more likely to engage in offline participation and did more of those things. We know voting, older people do it. Belonging to political parties, I already told you. Most of these activities, it's older people. Having a university degree makes you more likely to participate offline. Interest in politics is huge, right? Every 1 point, so we asked people, how interested are you in politics on a scale of 0 to 10? Every 1 point increase your likelihood to engage in politics by about 20%. Huge. A sense of civic duty mattered. These last two are kind of odd findings. I'm leaving them in to be transparent. We don't completely understand why being an internet user would make you more likely to vote or do things offline, but they do, as well as technological skills. Now, online activities, we find the gray ones, all those things aren't statistically significant. Age still is, but here's the really interesting thing that this doesn't show. The sign of it reverses. For online activity, the younger you are, the more likely you are to do it. And the magnitude of the effect is 4 times higher. So there is a slight age effect for offline participation. There's a big age effect, and it's the younger you are, the more likely you are to participate online. Being female makes you more likely to participate online. This blew us away, and when we presented this data at the World Congress of Political Science, our discussant was blown away because as far as she knew, nobody had ever found this before, which made us suspicious. We think a lot of this has to do with the number of things on our item that are about Facebook or sharing information on Twitter, and we know that women tend to be relatively more active on social media, so we think it just might be the items that we're using, but still, that tells us something. But interest in politics really, really matters. It's twice as important for online participation. Not a lot of people are doing it, but you have to be really, really interested to do online political participation. And technological skills matter in a really big way. We asked people how comfortable they were with computer technology. So again, I want to highlight the impact of age and being female. It kind of reverses traditional patterns of exclusion. We know women have tended to be outsiders in the political process. Young people have tended to be outsiders. Online, they're more active. But again, the overall percentages are low. So a few really tentative conclusions to wrap up because my time is almost up. First thing, age patterns suggest that media consumption is changing rapidly. You probably saw in the news in the last couple of days the massive layoffs in the post-media chain, right, where, especially in Calgary and Edmonton, the Calgary Sun, Calgary Herald, Edmonton Journal, Edmonton Sun, massive layoffs. 90 journalists lost their job a couple of days ago. Well, you've seen the data that shows why this is happening, right? People are going online to get their news, and they don't want to pay for it. And so this digital revolution is changing the way we gather information. Television is still number one. It's still dominant, but it is a matter of time before this digital revolution is complete. New technology, I think we can argue, really more supplements older technology. We've complicated the communications environment. It hasn't really simplified things. Politicians and governments can't just say, well, everyone's online. Whoops, lose my microphone here. Everything is online now. We don't need to do offline stuff. Citizens still want to drop by your office and still want to call you, and apparently some of them still want to write you letters, right? It hasn't completely switched to this new technology. So we are in this transition period. There's some bridging of the democratic divide. Age and gender flip online, and that's encouraging. But again, the number of things you can actually do online, they're fairly modest. They don't actually have a substantial impact, right? Voting online, or voting, actually helps to determine who's in power. Ranting on Facebook makes you feel better, but it doesn't actually accomplish anything. So those things are relatively powerless now. But we do see that it's changing the patterns of democratic engagement. Technological skills matter. We're seeing more young people being able to be involved in politics, but our fear in our research group is that as we do this, it introduces new barriers around technological skills. To be able to do this requires a certain degree of technological skills. So my father-in-law, who is a very active party member, I remember the party he supports had gone to an online vote, and he's volunteers, donates money. He couldn't figure out how to make this work. He didn't know how to do it. Very frustrating for him, right? So as we move to this, there is the danger of introducing new divides around technological skills. And we're probing this a little more in some of the studies. We've got some new data, and I haven't had a chance to really analyze it yet. So the big thing that I want to say is that 20 years after the Mosaic web browser, there really is not a sign of a renaissance in democratic citizenship. And the reason really comes down to this, right? I talked about these three things: resources, motivation, and mobilization. And digital technology, right, can affect resources. It can level the playing field, make things accessible in a way that wasn't the case before. It allows for easier mobilization. The one thing, you may have noticed, I glossed over this at the time, that it doesn't address is this. It doesn't address motivation. If you're not interested in politics, why would online change that? And I always use the example with my students of fly fishing. It has never been easier in the world to learn about fly fishing. There are websites out there with tons of information on fly fishing. You can learn about equipment, good places to go, talk about fly fishing to your heart's content. Here's the thing, if you're not interested in fly fishing, you've probably never been to those websites, have you? Because you're not interested. Why would politics be any different? So the digital revolution founders on this one thing, it doesn't change the problem of motivation. If people aren't interested, they're not going to look for it. And especially in an environment where we get to self-select the kind of media that we're going to consume. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions and comments.